The soft clinking of silverware, the faint hum of conversations, and the rich, intoxicating aroma of gourmet dishes filled the upscale restaurant. But for Jordan, none of it mattered. His mind was racing, his heart pounding as he sat at the polished, mahogany table waiting. This dinner was more than just a meal. This was his chance to prove himself, to show that despite the odds stacked against him, he could make it. As a black student from a modest background, Jordan had worked tirelessly to reach this point. Tonight, he was meeting with Mrs. Stevenson, a powerful businesswoman who had the potential to change his future. He straightened his tie and glanced at the door. Any moment now, Mrs. Stevenson would walk in, and then everything would begin. But just as he was trying to calm his nerves, a woman approached his table. She was in her early 30s, with blonde hair pulled back in a high, tight bun. Tiffany, the server, had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering a little too long on his modest suit. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and with a tone that was just a bit too casual, she said, "Good evening, sir. What can I get you to drink?" Jordan forced a smile, trying to brush off the slight unease he felt. "Just water for now, thank you." Tiffany nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, she hovered for a moment longer than necessary, eyeing the menu in front of him with a look that bordered on dismissive. She clicked her pen a few times before finally saying, "Are you sure you're at the right place? I mean, this is a pretty fancy restaurant. You might want to check the dress code." Jordan felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't surprised. He had encountered this kind of subtle prejudice before, but it still stung. He kept his voice steady. "I'm sure. I'm here for a meeting." Tiffany didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gave him a glance as if she were evaluating whether he was worthy of sitting in her restaurant. Finally, she turned on her heel and walked away, not before muttering under her breath, "Whatever." Jordan's face flushed with embarrassment. He looked down at the table, fighting to keep his composure. How had this happened? How had he, a young black man with everything to prove, ended up being treated like an outsider in a place that should have been welcoming? Just then, the door to the restaurant opened, and Mrs. Stevenson walked in, immediately scanning the room. Jordan stood up, grateful for the distraction. He quickly greeted her with a smile, doing his best to shake off the feeling of humiliation that Tiffany's words had left behind. But as Mrs. Stevenson made her way toward the table, something caught Jordan's eye. A man sitting in a corner booth had been watching the interaction closely. He had a calm, almost detached expression on his face, yet there was something about his gaze, intense, focused, that made Jordan uneasy. He couldn't place it, but there was something strangely familiar about him. The man's face seemed to relax as he saw Mrs. Stevenson approach Jordan's table. And then, without a word, he turned his attention back to the rest of the room. Unbeknownst to Jordan, the man in the corner was none other than Keanu Reeves, the owner of this very restaurant, who had been sitting in the back observing his staff and the atmosphere in his establishment, all while remaining incognito. Jordan had no idea, but Keanu had seen everything, and he wasn't happy. What would you do in Jordan's situation? Would you confront the prejudice, or would you hold your head high and keep going? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. But before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on what happens next. Jordan Reynolds wasn't just another student trying to make his way through college. He was someone who, from the very start, had to fight for everything he had. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in South Philly, Jordan knew the meaning of hard work and perseverance. His mother, a single parent, worked double shifts at a diner to keep food on the table. His father? He hadn't been around since Jordan was just a baby. Jordan's childhood was marked by constant challenges, financial struggles, limited access to resources, and the kind of adversity that most people never have to face. But those hardships also shaped him into the resilient young man he had become. He wasn't one to complain or make excuses. He had a dream, and no matter what obstacles came his way, he would push through. Ever since he was a child, Jordan had always excelled in school. He loved learning, and he had a natural knack for technology and business. But being a black student in a predominantly white school meant that Jordan had to work twice as hard to prove himself. Teachers often underestimated him. Classmates assumed he wouldn't amount to much. But Jordan wasn't easily discouraged. He channeled his frustration into his studies, determined to show them all that he was more than they thought. When he received an acceptance letter from a prestigious university, it felt like a victory, but also a reminder that he couldn't rest on his laurels. Scholarships helped him cover tuition, but he still had to take on multiple part-time jobs just to keep his head above water. One of those jobs was at a tech startup, where he worked late hours to gain experience. His mentor at the startup, Professor Roberts, was a seasoned entrepreneur who saw potential in Jordan from day one. He'd taken Jordan under his wing, teaching him the ins and outs of business strategy and leadership. Jordan's goal was to one day launch his own startup, but the road ahead seemed long and filled with more hurdles than he could count. Professor Roberts often reminded him, "It's not enough to be good at what you do. You have to be able to navigate a world that doesn't always give you the benefit of the doubt." It was this advice that had driven Jordan to seek out high-profile opportunities. That's how he found himself sitting in a fancy restaurant, waiting to meet Mrs. Stevenson, the woman who could offer him the business connection he desperately needed. He had to be there. This meeting was his chance to prove that he belonged at the table with the best of them. But as the events of tonight were showing him, the world wasn't always ready to offer him that seat at the table without a fight. Tiffany's judgmental eyes, her condescending tone, those things were all too familiar. Prejudice wasn't just something that lived in the past. It was something he faced every day, sometimes in the most subtle and insidious ways. Jordan took a deep breath as he watched Mrs. Stevenson settle into her seat across from him. He forced a smile, determined not to let the incident with Tiffany cloud his focus. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let a moment of disrespect knock him off course. Yet as the conversation with Mrs. Stevenson began, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a weight in the air, a tension that seemed to hang over the table. Was it just the remnants of the awkward encounter with Tiffany? Or was there something more at play here? Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves, still unnoticed by Jordan, observed the entire interaction from his corner booth. He had seen the look Tiffany gave Jordan, and he didn't like it. Keanu knew that the restaurant he had worked so hard to build had always been about inclusivity, about giving everyone the best experience, no matter their background, appearance, or status. Tiffany's behavior was completely unacceptable, and he wasn't about to let it slide. As Jordan tried to keep his composure during the meeting, Keanu's mind was already working, coming up with a plan to fix this, to make things right. But Jordan didn't know any of this yet. He was too focused on trying to impress Mrs. Stevenson and not let the world around him get in the way of his dream. Have you ever faced a situation where you were judged based on something beyond your control? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you can follow Jordan's journey all the way through. You won't want to miss what happens next. The conversation with Mrs. Stevenson started to flow, but the tension in the air never quite dissipated. Jordan focused on her, trying to block out the sting of Tiffany's earlier words. Mrs. Stevenson, a sharp, middle-aged woman with a commanding presence, was everything Jordan had hoped she would be. Engaged, intelligent, and thoughtful. She asked insightful questions about his business plans, his ideas, and his future goals. For a moment, Jordan felt like he was in control again, that maybe, just maybe, he could turn this dinner into something that would change his life. But just as Jordan was starting to feel like things were going well, Tiffany appeared at the table again. She was holding a tray of drinks, but her eyes immediately locked on Jordan. This time her smile was almost sarcastic, like she was amused by his presence, as if she found it hard to believe someone like him could belong here. "Here's your wine, ma'am," Tiffany said to Mrs. Stevenson, placing it in front of her with a little too much force. She then glanced down at Jordan, her gaze lingering for a moment before turning her attention back to the table. Jordan could feel the subtle insult in Tiffany's tone, but he tried to ignore it. He smiled politely and turned back to Mrs. Stevenson. But just as Tiffany was about to walk away, she paused. Without looking at him, she said, "So, sir, you don't want anything else? No appetizers, no drinks? You sure about that?" Her voice wasn't loud, but the condescending undertone was unmistakable. It was as if she was mocking him, implying that he didn't belong in this place, that someone like him couldn't possibly afford more than the water he'd ordered. Jordan's face flushed with embarrassment. The sting of her words hit him, harder this time, especially with Mrs. Stevenson sitting right across from him. He tried to keep his composure, but his hand tightened around the edge of his glass. Mrs. Stevenson, sensing the awkwardness, looked between Jordan and Tiffany. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice soft but with an edge of concern. Tiffany, still not looking at Jordan, shrugged. "Oh, I'm sure it's fine, just making sure our guest is comfortable." Mrs. Stevenson's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see," she said, her voice now colder. She looked at Jordan, offering a faint smile. "I hope you're enjoying the meal so far." Jordan nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, thank you. It's great." Tiffany stood there for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes flicking between Mrs. Stevenson and Jordan, before finally walking away with a dismissive air. Her actions were subtle, but they were designed to make Jordan feel small, out of place, like he wasn't worthy of sitting at the same table as people like Mrs. Stevenson. The tension between Jordan and Tiffany had reached its peak, but the situation was far from over. Jordan could feel his pulse quicken, the familiar rush of anger bubbling up inside him. This wasn't just about a rude comment or an uncomfortable situation anymore. It was about the way people judged him without even knowing, him without even giving him a chance. He knew that Tiffany wasn't the only person who thought like that. It wasn't just about her. It was about the system, about the way society often saw him, a black man trying to break through barriers that seemed insurmountable. His entire life had been a battle to prove that he was more than the stereotypes people held about him. But now, with Tiffany's words echoing in his mind, the battle felt more personal. The question wasn't just whether he would make it. It was whether the world would ever truly let him in. And as if on cue, Jordan noticed the man in the corner booth again. Keanu Reeves. He had been watching the entire exchange, his eyes flicking between Jordan and Tiffany, taking in every detail. Jordan couldn't help but wonder if he had noticed the same thing. What did this man think of the way Tiffany had treated him? What was he going to do about it? Keanu Reeves was the owner of this restaurant. He should have been aware of what was happening. But Jordan didn't know that Keanu had been watching from the moment Tiffany had made her first rude comment. Keanu had seen everything, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Mrs. Stevenson, noticing Jordan's discomfort, leaned in slightly. "Are you all right, Jordan?" she asked quietly. "You seem a little off." Jordan blinked and forced himself to snap out of his thoughts. "I'm fine," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Just, a lot on my mind." Mrs. Stevenson studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. She didn't push, but Jordan could tell she was picking up on the unease in the air. At that moment, Tiffany returned, this time with a little more purpose. She set down a small plate of bread on the table, glancing briefly at Jordan as she did so. Her eyes were sharp, almost accusatory, as though she had no interest in pretending to be polite anymore. Keanu, still observing from the corner booth, was getting ready to make his move. Have you ever had to endure prejudice in a public place? How did you handle it? Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. There's more to this story that you won't want to miss. The dinner continued in strained silence. Every exchange between Jordan and Mrs. Stevenson felt overshadowed by the tension in the air. The restaurant's usual ambience of sophistication had turned cold and uncomfortable, like an invisible storm cloud hanging over the table. Despite his best efforts to stay focused, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Tiffany's presence lingered, a reminder of the unspoken prejudice that seemed to follow him everywhere. But Jordan was determined. He wasn't going to let this moment define him, not when he had come so far. His future was on the line, and Mrs. Stevenson's offer, if she chose to make one, could change everything for him. As Mrs. Stevenson spoke about her business ventures and the connections she could help him build, Jordan's thoughts were half on the conversation, half on Tiffany and her condescending attitude. It wasn't just about the restaurant's ambiance or the food. It was about the feeling that someone like him, someone working so hard to prove his worth, was still being judged based on things he couldn't control. But just as he thought he might lose his composure, something unexpected happened. Keanu Reeves stood up from his corner booth, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but the way he stood, tall, purposeful, with a quiet strength, demanded attention. He approached Jordan's table, his gaze never wavering from Tiffany as she went about her duties. Jordan didn't notice him at first. He was still trying to manage his emotions, focusing on Mrs. Stevenson's words. But then the chair next to him scraped against the floor as someone took a seat. Jordan looked up, and his eyes widened when he saw the man who had been sitting quietly in the corner booth now standing beside him, Keanu Reeves. For a moment, Jordan couldn't find his words. This wasn't just some random diner or celebrity. This was Keanu Reeves, the man who had built this entire restaurant empire, the man whose name was synonymous with grace, class, and respect. And now he was standing beside him. "Excuse me." "Mrs. Stevenson," Keanu said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I hope you don't mind if I join you for a moment." Mrs. Stevenson looked up, surprised but nodding with a smile. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. It's an honor." Keanu nodded in acknowledgement, but turned his focus toward Tiffany, who had just placed another dish on the table. He didn't speak at first, but his eyes were piercing. Tiffany looked up at him, startled, as if she hadn't realized he was standing so close. There was something in his gaze, a quiet fury that immediately put her on edge. "Tiffany," Keanu said, his voice measured, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Tiffany, caught off guard, looked between him and the table. She hesitated, but then nodded stiffly. "Of course, Mr. Reeves." Keanu glanced at Jordan for a brief second, then stood back, signaling for Tiffany to follow him. Without a word to Mrs. Stevenson, Keanu led Tiffany toward the back of the restaurant, his steps firm and purposeful. Jordan watched, his heart racing, unsure of what was happening, but sensing that this was the moment everything was about to change. The tension in the air was palpable. Mrs. Stevenson, too, seemed uneasy, but she quickly regained her composure and turned to Jordan. "Mr. Reeves is a very private man," she said softly. "But if he's stepping in, it means something important has happened. Trust me, I've seen it before." Jordan couldn't take his eyes off the direction where Keanu and Tiffany had gone. His mind was racing. Had Keanu witnessed what had happened earlier? Did he understand the subtle prejudice Tiffany had displayed? Moments later, Keanu returned to the table, his expression calm, but his posture unwavering. Tiffany wasn't with him. He took a seat next to Jordan, his eyes still holding a quiet intensity. "I saw what happened," Keanu said, his voice low but clear, "and I want you to know that it won't happen again, not in my restaurant." Jordan felt a wave of relief flood over him, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Keanu's words, simple as they were like a lifeline. "Thank you," Jordan managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know what had just transpired behind the scenes, but it didn't matter. Keanu Reeves, the man behind the restaurant, had just made it clear that no one would tolerate the kind of disrespect he'd been shown. Keanu nodded, offering a rare, warm smile. "It's the least I can do. You don't deserve that treatment. And neither does anyone else in this restaurant." Jordan was speechless, still processing what had just happened. In the space of a few minutes, the whole dynamic of the evening had changed. This wasn't just about a dinner anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for what Jordan deserved, and for showing that people like Tiffany couldn't get away with their prejudices. Keanu's gaze softened. "And Mrs. Stevenson is right. You belong here. You have as much right to sit at this table as anyone." Jordan felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just about the offer from Mrs. Stevenson anymore. This was about being seen. This was about dignity. For the first time in a long time, Jordan felt like someone saw him for who he truly was, not who others assumed him to be. Before Jordan could respond, Mrs. Stevenson spoke again, her voice warm but determined. "Now, I don't know about you, too, but I'm ready to continue this conversation," she said, a playful glint in her eye. "Mr. Reeves, I think it's time we discuss business." Keanu smiled, and for the first time it didn't seem like he was just putting on a face. It was genuine, warm, the kind of smile that made Jordan feel like he had a real ally at this table. The conversation resumed, and this time, Jordan felt different, more confident, more grounded, but in the back of his mind he knew this was just the beginning. The real journey was only just starting, and he was determined to see it through. What would you have done if you were Jordan? Would you have stood up to the prejudice or stayed silent? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. The evening was starting to take a turn for the better. The air had lightened. After Keanu's intervention, and Jordan's tension had begun to ease. With Mrs. Stevenson's warm presence and Keanu's unexpected support, Jordan felt like he could finally breathe again. It was almost as if the universe had conspired to throw one final obstacle his way, only for him to triumph over it. But what Jordan didn't know was that the real shock of the night was still coming. As the conversation continued, Mrs. Stevenson began to open up more about the opportunities she could offer. Jordan could feel the weight of her words sinking in, a sense of hope building within him. This meeting wasn't just about getting a business connection. It was about proving to himself that he was capable, that he deserved to be here. Keanu was no longer just a silent observer. He chimed in from time to time, offering advice or suggestions, but it was clear that his focus was on Jordan. His respect for him wasn't just about his business sense or his ambitions. It was about his character, his resilience. That respect was a rare thing, and Jordan could feel it, running like an undercurrent beneath every word exchanged. But then, just as Jordan began to feel like the tide had truly turned, Mrs. Stevenson leaned in with an unexpected question that jolted him back into reality. "So, Jordan," she said, her voice calm but probing, "tell me a bit more about your background, about your family. You said you grew up in South Philly, yes?" Jordan froze, his heart beating a little faster. He'd always been wary of talking about his past, not because he was ashamed of it, but because it brought up so many painful memories. Memories of growing up without a father, of struggling to make ends meet, of being constantly overlooked. He had worked so hard to push all of that aside, to present himself as someone who had already overcome it all. But Mrs. Stevenson was persistent. She could tell there was more to Jordan's story. "I think understanding where you come from will give me a better picture of who you are and what you've had to overcome," she said, her tone gentle yet insistent. Keanu, sensing the shift in the conversation, leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression neutral. He wasn't pushing, but he was clearly waiting for Jordan to respond. The restaurant's soft chatter around them seemed to fade into the background as Jordan felt the weight of their gazes. Jordan hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice lower than before. "My mom, she raised me on her own. She worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. I didn't have a lot growing up, still don't have much, but she always told me, if you want something, you have to fight for it. Nothing's ever handed to you." Jordan swallowed, his throat tightening. He hadn't planned on saying this much, but once the words started to spill out, they seemed to take on a life of their own. "I remember being in school, and no one ever really saw me for who I was. They just saw a kid from a rough neighborhood, someone who didn't have the right clothes or the right last name. And it hurt. A lot. But my mom always told me that no matter how much the world tried to box me in, I could rise above it." Keanu's eyes softened, and Mrs. Stevenson leaned forward, a slight smile on her face as she listened intently. Jordan could feel his emotions stirring again, but this time it wasn't anger or frustration. It was a mix of vulnerability and pride. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it hasn't been easy. Every step forward felt like a fight, but I've made it this far, and I'm not about to let anything or anyone stop me from getting where I need to be." The table was silent for a moment as Jordan let his words hang in the air. The vulnerability he had shared wasn't something he did often, but somehow, in this moment, it felt right. It felt like a revelation, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Mrs. Stevenson was the first to break the silence. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "Jordan, you have no idea how much that means to me. That kind of determination, that drive to overcome everything life throws at you, it's exactly the kind of thing we need in the business world." Keanu nodded in agreement. I've seen a lot of people with potential, but what I've seen from you tonight is something different. It's rare, and it's real. That's what matters most." Jordan felt his heart swell. He had come into this dinner expecting nothing more than a business opportunity, but what he was leaving with now was something much more valuable. Respect, understanding, and maybe, just maybe, the chance to make his mark on the world. But as he basked in the glow of this newfound validation, something else hung in the air, something Jordan hadn't expected. The truth about Tiffany's behavior and the deeper implications of what had just happened were only now beginning to unfold. Keanu's voice broke the silence once more, this time with a quiet intensity. "Jordan," he said, his eyes locking. Onto him, "I need to tell you something about Tiffany." Jordan's stomach churned. He had known that the waiter's behavior was wrong, but now he had the unsettling feeling that there was more to this than he realized. "I've seen her before," Keanu continued, his tone darkening. "I've had complaints about her, not just from you, but from other customers. She's been a problem for a while, and frankly, it's time she learned that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated in my restaurant." Jordan's heart raced. "What do you mean? What's going to happen?" Keanu's gaze hardened. "She'll be taken care of, I'm making sure of that. No one, especially someone like her, gets to treat people like that under my roof." It was an unexpected turn of events, and Jordan couldn't quite process it. The support he had received in the last few minutes had already been overwhelming, but this was something else entirely. Tiffany wasn't just going to face consequences. For her actions, she was going to be held accountable. And as the truth about Tiffany's behavior became clearer, Jordan felt a strange sense of justice wash over him. The world wasn't always fair, but in this moment it seemed like things were finally aligning in his favor. The emotional intensity of the evening was far from over, but Jordan now had a sense of clarity. He wasn't just a survivor of the struggles he had faced, he was a fighter. And with people like Mrs. Stevenson and Keanu Reeves on his side, the path ahead felt a little bit brighter. What would you do if you were in Jordan's shoes? How would you handle a situation like Tiffany's? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. There's more coming your way. The conversation lingered in the air as the night wore on. Keanu's words, calm yet resolute, echoed in Jordan's mind. Tiffany's fate had been sealed, but there was still a lingering weight in the room, as though the entire evening had been a turning point, not just for Jordan, but for everything he had come to understand about his journey. As the final courses were cleared from the table, Jordan's thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded. Mrs. Stevenson, always the professional, had seamlessly shifted the topic back to business. But Jordan's mind wasn't fully on the negotiations anymore. His eyes were on Keanu, who had quietly observed the interactions from the corner of the table. He had given Jordan the kind of validation few ever received, an understanding that wasn't just about business, but about humanity. Jordan looked up, meeting Keanu's gaze. There was something in those eyes that spoke volumes. It wasn't just the acknowledgement of his hard work or the respect for his perseverance. It was the recognition that some battles weren't won through grit alone, but by the quiet moments when someone finally decided to stand up and be seen. The dinner finally came to an end, the awkward tension from earlier now replaced by a newfound sense of camaraderie. Mrs. Stevenson, always the gracious host, extended her final thoughts to Jordan. "I'm glad we could have this conversation," she said, her voice warm but serious. "I see potential in you, Jordan. You've got the right mindset. I'd like to stay in touch and see where this partnership could go." Jordan nodded, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Stevenson. This means a lot to me. You won't regret it." Keanu, who had remained relatively silent during the last part of the dinner, stood up and extended his hand. "I'm glad you were able to see the truth of things tonight," he said. "The world can be a tough place, but it's people like you who keep pushing through that make a difference. Keep that fire alive." Jordan stood up to shake Keanu's hand, feeling the weight of his words. The simple gesture felt like a promise, one that Jordan had made to himself long ago, but had struggled to keep. Tonight, in front of some of the most powerful figures he had ever encountered, he had not only held his ground, but had earned their respect. "You won't hear me giving up," Jordan said, a genuine smile creeping onto his face. "Not now, not ever." Keanu smiled back, a brief but meaningful exchange of understanding passing between them. There was no need for words. Jordan knew that Keanu had seen him, really seen him, and that was worth more than any business opportunity or financial deal The night came to a close. Mrs. Stevenson gathered her things, preparing to leave. "I'll be in touch, Jordan," she said with a final nod. "Take care of yourself." Jordan didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of hope. He had faced his fears, confronted the prejudice that had always been a shadow behind him, and come out stronger on the other side. The universe had a way of testing people, but it also had a way of offering second chances. Keanu turned to leave, but before he did, he paused at the entrance to the restaurant. He glanced back at Jordan, his expression softening just a little. "Remember," he said, "you deserve to be here." It wasn't just a piece of advice, it was a declaration, and it meant the world to Jordan. As Keanu left, Jordan stood there, for a moment, feeling the weight of the night's events settle around him. He'd arrived at the restaurant feeling out of place, unsure if he belonged. But now, as the cool night air brushed against his face and the last of the dinner crowd slowly made their way out, Jordan realized something. He had been wrong to doubt himself. The world had tried to label him, tried to box him in. But now, with every step he took, Jordan knew that he was writing his own story. The journey that had started with a single, painful moment of prejudice had evolved into something greater. And now, he had the chance to define his own success as He stepped out of the restaurant and into the crisp night air. Jordan felt a new sense of clarity wash over him. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore, he was fighting to thrive. What does success look like for you? What steps are you taking to make your dreams a reality, despite the obstacles in your way? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The journey isn't over. Let's continue this adventure together. The days after the dinner at the upscale restaurant were a blur for Jordan. His thoughts often drifted back to that pivotal evening, the moment Keanu Reeves had validated him, when Mrs. Stevenson had offered a path forward, and when Tiffany's actions had revealed the deeper issues that had always lingered just beneath the surface. That night had been more than just a business opportunity. It had been a defining moment in his life. But now, back to reality, Jordan had to figure out what came next. He had set his sights on a brighter future, but what was the next step in this newfound journey? It was one evening, a week later, when Jordan found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the email from Mrs. Stevenson. She had followed through just as she promised. An invitation to a meeting had arrived, a chance to further discuss the potential partnership. The words on the screen were simple, but the weight of them was profound. Jordan's heart raced with excitement and nerves. He had come from nothing but a fierce determination to prove his worth. And now he was on the verge of something monumental. The opportunity that Mrs. Stevenson had extended to him was real, and it was everything he had worked for. But there was a fear inside him, a voice whispering, "What if I don't belong? What if this is all too much?" But as quickly as the doubt crept in, Jordan shook it off. This was his moment. He had already survived worse. He had already fought harder than most people could ever imagine. And now, with the support of people like Keanu Reeves and Mrs. Stevenson, he wasn't going to let self-doubt hold him back. He clicked reply and typed a quick response, his fingers flying over the keys with certainty. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Stevenson. I'm looking forward to our meeting. I won't let you down." As he hit send, Jordan realized something important. This wasn't just a business deal. This was his chance to redefine himself, to finally stop questioning whether he deserved to be in these rooms, at these tables with these people. This was his path forward, and he was ready to walk it. Later that evening, as Jordan walked through the city streets to clear his mind, he thought about everything that had led him to this point. He remembered the days when he felt invisible, when no one saw his worth, when his dreams seemed distant and out of reach. But now all that had changed. He thought about Tiffany, how her cruelty had almost derailed his confidence, but then he remembered Keanu's words, "You deserve to be here." That simple statement had shaken him to his core. In that moment, he realized something profound. The world might try to limit him, but it couldn't define him. He had the power to decide who he was and where he was going. As he walked past the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Jordan passed the small deli where he used to work, the same place he had spent countless hours scrubbing tables and making sandwiches. It was a reminder of where he had come from and how far he had already come. He had worked hard to escape that world, to build a life that was his own, and now that hard work was paying off. The city around him seemed different now. The sounds of honking cars, the buzz of streetlights, the chatter of people, all of it had taken on a new meaning. It was his city too. He wasn't just a bystander in his own life anymore. He was shaping it, defining it, and stepping into the future he had long dreamed of. Jordan stopped for a moment, looking up at the skyline. The lights glittered in the distance, reminding him that the world was vast and full of possibilities. This was his moment to take control, to build the life he had always wanted, and it wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges ahead. There always were. But as he stood there, in the heart of the city that had shaped him, Jordan knew that he was no longer the person he once was. He had changed, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Jordan sat down at his kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, his mind focused and determined. It was time to prepare for the meeting with Mrs. Stevenson. The chance to work with her could change everything. And with Keanu Reeves' unexpected support, Jordan now knew that he had the confidence to walk into that meeting with his head held high. As the coffee steam rose, Jordan thought back to the night of the dinner. It had been more than just a turning point. It had been the beginning of his new life. He had learned something invaluable that night, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is believe in yourself. No one else would do it for you. The time for doubting was over. Jordan was ready. Have you ever faced a turning point in your life where everything seemed to shift? How did you handle it? Share your story with us in the comments, and if you enjoyed Jordan's journey, hit that subscribe button to follow along with more inspiring tales. The road to success isn't easy, but it's worth it. Let's walk it together. The day had finally arrived. Jordan had spent the entire morning preparing for the meeting, double-checking his notes, going over the numbers, and rehearsing his pitch. This meeting with Mrs. Stevenson could change everything. It wasn't just about the potential partnership. It was about proving to himself that he had made it, that he could hold his own in a room full of influential people. But despite all the preparation, the nerves still crept in. The butterflies in his stomach fluttered with every passing minute. He had faced adversity before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now, and there was no room for hesitation. There was no turning back. Jordan stood in front of the glass doors to the upscale office building, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. As he walked through the sleek, modern lobby, he felt the weight of his past and future collide. The polished floors, the bright lighting, the polished suits of the people around him. It was all so different from the neighborhood he had grown up in. It was a reminder of how far he had come. The receptionist greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Jordan. Mrs. Stevenson is expecting you. She's in the boardroom on the 12th floor. Jordan nodded, forcing a smile, and followed the receptionist's directions to the elevator. As the doors closed behind him, he leaned against the wall, trying to steady his nerves. His mind kept wandering to the dinner from a week ago, the support he had felt from Keanu, the respect from Mrs. Stevenson, the clarity he had gained about his own worth. All of that had led him here, to this very moment. The elevator dinged softly as it arrived at the 12th floor, and Jordan stepped out, his heart pounding. He was greeted by another assistant, who guided him down a long corridor to the large glass-walled boardroom at the end. Mrs. Stevenson was already seated at the head of the table, her confident smile reassuring Jordan as he walked in. She stood, up as he approached, extending her hand in greeting. "Jordan, it's so good to see you again. Please have a seat," she said, her voice warm but professional. Jordan shook her hand, settling into the chair across from her. As the door clicked shut behind him, a sense of calm washed over him. He had been preparing for this meeting for days, but now that he was here, he was ready. This was his moment to prove that he belonged, to show that he had the ideas, the drive, and the ability to succeed. Mrs. Stevenson wasted no time. "I've gone over your proposal, Jordan, and I have to say I'm impressed. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this, and your vision for the project is strong." Jordan felt a surge of pride. She was impressed. That meant something. He had been nervous, unsure of how she would respond to his ideas, but hearing her praise now made all those sleepless nights and moments of doubt feel worth it. "Thank you," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "I've worked hard on this, and I'm confident that it's something that can bring value not just to the company, but to the community as well." Mrs. Stevenson leaned back in her chair, nodding thoughtfully. "I can see that. But you know, Jordan, this isn't just about the numbers or the business plan. It's about character too. It's about how you handle pressure, how you respond when things don't go according to plan. You've shown that you can rise to the occasion, but can you maintain that resilience when the stakes are even higher?" The question hung in the air for a moment, but Jordan was prepared. He had learned over the years that resilience wasn't something you could fake. It came from experience, from the challenges you faced and overcame. And he had faced plenty of challenges. He met her, his voice steady. "I've been through a lot in my life, Mrs. Stevenson, more than most people would ever guess, but I've learned that when things get tough, you don't quit, you adapt, you push forward, even when it seems impossible. That's what I've always done, and that's what I'll continue to do." Mrs. Stevenson smiled, clearly satisfied with his response. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Character is just as important as strategy in this business. And I believe you have the character we're looking for." At that moment, the door to the boardroom opened, and in walked a familiar face. It was Keanu. He had been quietly watching from the back of the room, a silent presence, but now he stepped forward and took a seat beside Mrs. Stevenson. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. What was Keanu doing here? Mrs. Stevenson turned toward him, her eyes softening in recognition. "Keanu, it's good to see you. I wasn't expecting you today." Keanu smiled, his laid-back demeanor unchanged. "I wanted to see how things were. Going, Mrs. Stevenson, Jordan's been making quite the impression on me, and I thought I'd sit in on this one." Jordan's heart raced. Keanu had been more than just a silent ally at the dinner. He had been a mentor, a guide. To have him here in this important meeting felt like a sign that everything was coming full circle. Mrs. Stevenson looked between the two men, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad you're both here. Jordan, I have to tell you that after reviewing your proposal and hearing your thoughts today, I'm convinced you're exactly the kind of person we want to partner with." Jordan's mind raced. This was it. This was the moment he had worked for, the opportunity to finally make a real impact. "You've earned this," Mrs. Stevenson continued, smiling. "We'd like to move forward with your proposal. We'll work out the details, of course, but consider this your official invitation to join us." Jordan couldn't believe it. The weight of the moment sank in, but it felt like a dream. All the struggles, the doubts, the setbacks, they had led to this. He had made it. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down, I promise." Mrs. Stevenson nodded, her smile warm. "I know you won't." As the meeting wrapped up, Jordan stood to leave, but Keanu stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jordan. You've earned this. And remember, it's not just about what you can do for the business. It's about what you can do for yourself. You've got a future ahead of you. Don't forget that." Jordan nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. The journey wasn't over, but it was just beginning. And this time, he knew he was ready. Have you ever faced a critical moment like Jordan's? What was your reaction when you realized you had earned something you worked so hard for? Share your story in the comments below. And if you're inspired by Jordan's journey, make sure to hit subscribe for more stories of resilience and growth. The path to success is full of challenges, but it's worth every step. The weeks following the meeting with Mrs. Stevenson were a whirlwind. Jordan had officially signed the partnership agreement, and the project he had pitched was now underway. He couldn't quite believe how much his life had changed in such a short time. He had gone from a nervous, struggling individual, questioning his worth, to someone with a seat at the table of some of the most influential players in the business world. But despite the excitement and success, Jordan knew that his journey was far from over. The real work was just beginning. The challenges ahead would test him, push him to his limits, and require more than just the skills he had honed over the years. It would take everything he had: his resilience, his heart, his vision. And for the first time in his life, Jordan felt ready. He wasn't just showing up for a meeting anymore. He wasn't just trying to prove himself to others. Now, he was building something that was uniquely his, a project that would make a lasting impact. Every day, Jordan woke up with a sense of purpose. The feeling that had once been a faint spark of hope was now a blazing fire, pushing him to take on the day with determination. It wasn't just the business that had changed. His mindset, his perspective on life, and most importantly, his belief in himself had transformed. There were still days when the doubts crept in, when the fear of failure whispered in his ear. But those moments were fewer now. Jordan had learned to silence the voice of self-doubt. He knew that he had earned his place in the world, and that realization was empowering. One evening, as Jordan sat in his apartment overlooking the city skyline, he thought back to that night at the restaurant. Keanu Reeves's words had echoed in his mind over and over, "You deserve to be here." It was a simple statement, but it had meant everything. At that moment, Jordan understood that success wasn't just about making money or climbing the corporate ladder. It was about proving to yourself that you were worthy of your own dreams, that you had the power to make them come true. As Jordan sat there reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point, he realized something else. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that restaurant weeks ago. He had grown. He had evolved, and the best part was he knew he wasn't done yet. The journey was still unfolding. Jordan pulled out his phone and glanced at a message from Mrs. Stevenson. It was a simple note confirming their next meeting. He smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges, more hurdles, but also more opportunities to prove himself. And he was ready for all of it. Keanu had given him more than just business advice. He had given him something far more valuable, the belief that no matter where you come from, no matter the obstacles in your way, you have the power to carve your own path. It was up to you to take that first step and to keep moving forward, no matter what. As Jordan sat back watching the lights of the city flicker below, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had faced his fears, overcome the prejudices that tried to define him, and now he was on the path to greatness. The journey was his, and it was just getting started. What's the next step in your journey? What dream have you been holding? Back waiting for the perfect moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let's keep this conversation going. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more stories about overcoming obstacles and building the future you deserve. We're all on this path together, and it's time to take that first step.